Good evening, everyone. Welcome back again to our second year for doing the feeding series. This is brought to you by the Pacific Division Feeding Group, Feeding Leadership. My name is Yi-Wei. I'm a volunteer from the Los Angeles region. Several things for housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded. It will get published on YouTube if you search Pacific Division YouTube, you will find that. The slides has already been sent out for the reminder email that was sent out earlier today. Please remember to log in your own hours, and this is a capacity building series, so this you will not receive Edge credit. And with that, I'd like to pass to Mary for her to introduce her team and also the presenters for today. Mary, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Yue, for all of your help and all your organizational skills. I'm Mary Prather. I'm the Pacific Division Feeding Lead. I'm also from Gold Country region in California and the feeding lead there. And with me tonight is Jerry Geiler. Jerry, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jerry Geiler. I am the regional feeding lead for the Northwest region. And that's who I am.
Thank you, Jerry. Jerry has the second half of this presentation, so we're going to jump right in. So could we get the first slide, Yue? So here's the goal for this series. Iwe said you're not getting Edge credit for a class, which is true, but you do get hours this. But our goal is to help volunteers understand and build the capacity and confidence to undertake various feeding roles within the Pacific Division. I think there are other divisions that have joined us tonight, but I want you to know that this is primarily focused on activities within the Pacific Division. Next slide, please. So I first want to address this. Well, we're not doing feeding anymore. That's not true. Feeding is here to stay. It's not going away. I know there's some concern that the Red Cross doesn't do cooking anymore, and therefore we're not really feeding. But what's happening is we are transitioning to leveraging our communities and the partners within those communities to provide those services for us. But we need feeding people, Red Cross feeding people, to help those partners. We can't have a shelter open unless we feed people. So trust me when I say there will always be feeding activity going on when we have disaster operations going on and shelters open. Next slide, please. So if you do not have your feeding gap at this point, there are courses in Edge that you can take. We're not trying to replace those. We're just here to fill in some information gaps. Here's the information you get in the course. Here's what it's like in the real world. Next slide, please. So what's it all about? What's this series going to take place? We're going to talk about actions in blue skies as well as gray skies. We're going to talk about different types of feeding that we are now doing, now that we are not cooking. We're going to talk about food safety. We're going to talk about how we pay for food, how you order food. We're going to talk about working in a field kitchen. That's working with one of our partners who is actually doing the cooking. And then we're going to talk about, the fun stuff, some forms and paperwork, which is always involved. Lots of forms and paperwork in feeding. So each one of those will come in succeeding Wednesdays. There's a few little variations, as many of you know, with the Pacific Division. And that is most of our events are no notice events versus noticed events. What do I mean by that? That's those all of a sudden a wildfire pops up and it's raging through a town versus we see a hurricane on the horizon. We know the path we think it's going to take so we can get ready for it. So the known path of destruction versus the unpredictable path with wildfires, the wind shifts both morning and evening. Different things happen to move it around so we don't always know the path. In many of our cases, with the exception of recently in LA, we run a lot of smaller shelters as opposed to the large shelters that we sometimes see in other divisions. Again, with the exception of what we just experienced in LA. And many, many places in the Pacific Division are more rural rather than city. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk briefly, like 7 minutes, more about the philosophical approach to feeding. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts, but I want to give you some food for thought. I am very passionate about feeding, and that will come across, I hope. And so these are just things to think about as you go through this series. First of all, I'm not going to read you this slide, but I want you to know there's a way to go from transactional things like where we used to do. I know you've heard the new philosophy. We're going from transactional to transformational for our clients. So take a look at this slide later. There's a way we can be transformational in how we feed people. We don't just have to hand them an individually packaged meals on the line and just hand them out as fast as we can. We can engage with the client. We can talk to them. We can share experiences with them. So think about this not only tonight, but as you go through the series. Next slide, please. Okay, language matters. Language matters a lot. And how many of you have ever heard someone say something and think, oh my God, was that an insult? Or, oh my goodness, really? Language is important. And what I try and do is help people use different words, not just always feeding, feeding, feeding. Feeding to me, you're going to see a picture up here pretty soon. So at least in Gold Country, and I'm thinking some other places, we really like to talk about shelter cuisine and not just food. Next slide, please. What do you picture when someone says feeding versus dining versus meal times? Okay, next slide. Let's take a look. So we have a slide reversed here. Okay, that's all right. So one of the things that's important to remember is we don't just eat with our mouths, right? I mean, you walk into a restaurant that you like and you smell all the aromas and you get a feeling or a sense. The dining room may be lit a little bit low lighting and it's nice. So we use all of our senses when we enjoy a meal. So here I'm going to ask you to think about this in the future. Which would you prefer? Feeding, dining, mealtime? You can decide how you present the food to the clients. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I did cover this. You can see seeing is very important. Are you going to want a sandwich that has mold on the bread? So are you going to want a meal that's kind of spilled over into all of its different compartments when we do the individually packaged meals in the clamshells? No, we're gonna take great care in making sure the food tastes good, looks good, smells good. Next slide, and you can skip for me. That was my mistake anyway. So it's not just about the food. Okay, we get a chance to provide comfort and support. I hear people all the time say, oh, they really want comfort food. They want comfort. We just happen to use food as a way to do that. Comfort food doesn't have to be what you had when you were growing up. It's that engaging in with someone else around a meal, around food items. On the worst day of their lives, you guys, we get to make people feel better. And I think feeding has a better opportunity to do that than any activity in the Red Cross. And I am so glad you guys are interested in feeding. Next slide. And I think we're done. This is something that I truly believe in. When we feed people, futures are nourished. It's not just we're sustaining their bodily functions. We're helping people to grow. We're helping people to get strength back from the disaster they were in. We're helping people move out of the shelters. We really have an opportunity to nourish someone's future, someone's life. So that's a philosophical standpoint that I want you to think about through the series. We really want to elevate, if you will, the feeding experience for our clients. And I want to turn it over to Jerry because she's got some great tips on how to be a super great feeding SA.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And for those of you who attended last year, this is a little bit different than last year's, but essentially the same because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is essentially what Mary mentions is that we're client facing. We have the opportunity to get to know clients on a personal basis at least a few times during the day. And so we have some real great responsibilities as a feeding service associate. And I also like the idea that I've not like the term I'm a feeding service associate, because I feel like that says something about the style of my delivery, how I feed you, how I interact with you. So I really do like the idea that I'm serving our clients and I'm serving them a meal. Again, as Mary says, to nourish and beyond. So tonight's objectives again is what is a feeding service associate? As the Red Cross looks at us, what do their expectations of us are, and what are the attributes of a feeding service associate? What kinds of opportunities are available to us? What will I do on a DR, a large DR versus a small DR? And then some tips on how to go forward and be the best we can be. Next slide, please. So Red Cross defines the role of the feeding associate is to serve as a member of a temporary work unit on a disaster relief operation. We ensure food safety and proper food service in a variety of work locations. Food safety is really, really important. I won't be covering that tonight. That's in a future session. But in all the things that I'm going to be discussing tonight, the underlying thing is we want to make sure that the way we handle, the way we present, and the way we interact with our clients is as safe as possible, so that we limit the opportunity to transfer any kinds of foodborne illnesses or other kinds of illnesses, contact illnesses, for instance. So as we're thinking about how we interact with our clients, just keep that in mind as well, that down the road you'll be hearing more about the proper handling of our food. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the responsibilities as a feeding service associate, we talk about just meeting the disaster-caused feeding needs of individuals, disaster-related, why are they displaced, and this also helps us focus on what kinds of food and cuisine that we provide to our clients. We prepare and serve meals that meet cultural, religious, and dietary sensitivities for our clients, because as we know, there's more and more and more sensitivities showing up in our in our shelters, where people have nut sensitivities, they have health-related sensitivities, but there's also the cultural sensitivities and the religious sensitivities. We know about kosher diets and halal food, so we have to know who requires those kinds of meals. Again, practicing safe food handling at all times. Clear communication, both with our clients and with our up chain. I call it the up chain. That's your supervisor, and then even back to headquarters if necessary. And providing feedback constantly. Are clients eating the food that we've provided? Are they making comments about what kinds of foods we provide? Different kinds of feedback can be fed back up through the chain, our supervisory chain, and that influences the purchases that we make and the way we present our food. Next slide, please. So what are the attributes of a great service associate? First, you have to understand the job. Second, I believe you have to be curious. I find that the most curious of people tend to ask questions and get good answers, helps them understand what their role is better, so it supports the understanding, but it also allows them to observe actions and interactions and learn from that. Participation always is important. It's not fun to go to a DR and have a role and sit on the sidelines while other people are actively involved because you're not sure of what you're going to do or how you're going to interact with people. And then again, communication, both with the clients and then with your Red Cross associates, your team members, and then up through the chain. Next slide, please. So how do I understand what my role is? When I get the call to go to a DR, what's my role? Workforce engagement will generally tell you what you're being assigned as, whether you're going to be assigned as a service associate, if you're going in as a shelter worker or a feeding worker, because a lot of times you'll get to a DR and you'll be assigned as a shelter worker, but may be being supportive as a feeding associate, even though you don't have that gap, because a lot of times we don't have enough volunteers to assign specific feeding service associates to the smaller DRs. So you might be a shelter associate and be performing feeding functions. Where am I going? Your workforce engagement will tell you, and your IAP will give you a lot of information. If you use the Volunteer Connection app, you will see who you report to. And if you look at the IAP, the Incident Action Plan, you will see who the teams are that are assigned to the larger DOs where an IAP is required. What are my tasks? You get those from your supervisor. So if you want to understand more about the role you'll be playing and the specific tasks that you're going to be doing, everyone has a supervisor, and it's important to ask those kinds of questions so that you understand what's expected of you, and then you can perform to the best of your ability. Next slide, please. So you have to understand the types of disasters, and as Mary said, most of our disasters start off as local, regional disasters. They can move into regional, national, and they can be leveled as 1 through 7. In the Pacific Division, we have, as we've just experienced, a couple level 7s with the Maui fires and the California wildfires, and we've had 4 and above with our wildfires. Our Oso landslide here in Washington State. All these responses require different levels of support from our disaster team workers and from our service associates. If you're on a small apartment fire, you may be going and picking up food. You may be working with a logistics person, may interact with people in a very different way depending on the level of the disaster that you're assigned to. Next slide, please. Disaster levels are the indication of the expected complexity of an operation. So what that tells you is that your leadership may be structured differently depending on the level of disaster. If you're in a smaller response, like an apartment fire, and you maybe have 10 to 20 people in your shelter, you may not even have a feeding manager for yourself. You may be required to work with the job director or the local DPM for understanding where to get food, or your regional feeding lead, which is kind of a role that I've assumed. In some of the smaller disasters, people will just call me and ask me who provides food in our area. So you'll see that depending on the level of the disaster, if you're in a national disaster, you're going to have a lot of people on top of you that are handling a lot of the bigger tasks, getting the food delivered, getting the food ordered, making sure that the food comes from food safe places, paying the bills, all those kinds of things. But if you're on a smaller disaster, you may have different roles and a few different responsibilities there. Next slide, please. So local feeding, regional responses, the kinds of responses are canteening, which is maybe supporting a search and rescue opportunity, or maybe doing a warming shelter or something like that. We don't do a lot of those anymore. Congregate shelters are where we're going to focus tonight. We're going to talk about mostly congregate shelters where we have people that are in multi-bed location, a multi-bed facility, shelter that we've opened, or maybe a partner has opened and we're providing feeding services there. Non-congregate feeding is people that have been assigned hotel rooms. It can also include mobile feeding or fixed feeding sites that are outside of a shelter. So today we're going to concentrate pretty much on the congregate shelter rather than the other two types of responses. Next slide, please. So if I'm feeding in a congregate shelter on a DRO, some of the things that I might be required to do is food delivery or pickup. A lot of times you coordinate that, your manager or your supervisor will coordinate that with your logistics department. I worked on a DRO where I actually worked directly with the logistics supervisor, and he had a rotating team that went and picked up food. And again, as Mary alluded to, in the Pacific Division, we have a lot of rural areas, and a lot of our volunteers in Washington State, we have volunteers out on the islands, and they're not going to be readily available to come in and do a food run for you. So you have to be cognizant of where your shelter is located, and especially in your smaller shelters, who can provide food there. So food delivery and pickup may or may not be one of your responsibilities, but it may be helpful for you to understand where the food is coming from and how it gets to you. Food preparation, we don't have a lot of food preparation, but if we do have a larger DRO, a larger number of clients in our shelters, we may pick up food from a caterer or have it delivered, and it would come in our Cambros, and we would have to serve it into clamshells or other kinds of containers for our clients. It's important that our clients know what meal times are. If we don't tell them when the food is going to be delivered, maybe they won't show up. They do have lives that have to continue in the face of their disaster. A lot of times they'll go out to school. They still have to go to school. They still have to go to work. They still have responsibilities to their children or other family members. So if they know what the meal times are and they know when the meals are going to be served, that is extremely important. We also need to understand the use of the kitchens. In our facilities that we are assigned, we don't know where we're going to until the last minute in a shelter. We don't know if there's a kitchen there. We don't know exactly what facilities we're going to have access to. So it's important to understand those kinds of things. We also need to know, what are we going to do with any kinds of leftovers? Waste is a big problem when we order too much food, or people have not had advantage of a posted meal time and they just did not realize the food was being served at that time. So we have to have a place to store the leftovers. And then we also have to keep track of people that are inside our shelter and outside our shelters, because we do offer meals to clients who don't necessarily want to stay in our shelters, but we do need to understand, we invite them to our table. They can come in and have meals with us, but we do need to understand how many people are going to show up for our meal times. Okay, next. So what are the immediate supplies we need for feeding? Well, it depends on the time you're open. And in my experience, disaster seems to happen more later in the day, and most of our shelters open up around dinner time or after dinner time. So based on the time of opening is what you can provide your client base, and then you can start planning for subsequent days. A P card may be used for purchasing necessities, things that you don't have on hand. If someone in your shelter has a P card, or your feeding supervisor has one, someone will have a P card. Feeding kits are part of the shelter trailer. In most cases, a trailer will show up at the shelter, and in it will be some of your basic beginning supplies, like a coffee tea service. Even our shelter trailers up here in our division or our region have sweet and salty snacks in. They have assorted waters. They have paper goods, utensils, disposable aprons. They have all kinds of things. And there's a person assigned to that trailer to rotate through that stuff and make sure that expiration dates are within the proper time frames. But we have those things ready to go. On some of the more remote areas where we don't have a shelter trailer show up, we have hubs in the chapter offices or field office. And you can go pick those up and get started, because people are looking for, while they're waiting around to sign into SCIA to be entered into the shelters, it's nice to be able to hand them a bottle of water and a snack. Next slide, please. Congregate feeding facilities. It's important, and this may not be part of an SA's job, but when you come on the job, if you're a shift worker and you're coming on and you're just assigned to the shelter, you should confirm with your supervisor or the shelter manager that we do have access to the kitchen, because quite often I have been on disasters where you don't have access to the kitchen. So you have to decide how you're going to handle certain kinds of activities and what you're going to do with storage and things like that. You have to then also confirm if you have access to the kitchen, you may have access to the sinks, but they may have locks on the refrigerators. So if you don't have access to the refrigerators, you need to know that. Usually this all is handled beforehand with your facilities manager. But again, it's kind of your responsibility when you come on shift to confirm what's out of bounds and what's in bounds as far as your use. Are there ways around not having a refrigerator? Yes, if your shelter is going to be open for a longer period of time, I have actually heard of calling your logistics department and getting refrigerator delivered from Lowe's or from a hardware place. So there are workarounds. We always, again, try to get to yes. Can you use the microwave? Can you use, if there's automatic coffee makers, can we use it? Are there separate shelves for us to use? Pots and pans, can we use your pots and pans? Do we need to use our own? Why am I talking about pots and pans when we don't cook? Because sometimes we heat water for a baby bottle or something like that. So we do have opportunities to use facilities. Commercial sinks, cleaning supplies, can we use their cleaning supplies? Do we have to provide our own? If we use their cleaning supplies, we have to replenish those supplies too. That's usually handled by the shelter manager. But again, we're responsible for keeping a clean work environment in our food service areas. So those kinds of things. And when we do have garbage and trash, can we use the big garbage cans outside? If the garbage is only picked up once a week and we're throwing, now I hate to say this, but we're throwing lots of food in there because we have no place to store it or whatever, that's going to fill up real quick. And then who's my contact person? Who's my up chain? If I need something or I see we're deficient in something or something isn't going right, who do I contact? Next slide, please. So again, we need to post the hours. We have people that work night shifts or something else, so we can make accommodations for them. We'll reserve a meal for them and hold it back, but they need to understand what hours we actually are open for dedicated food service. We need to understand food restrictions, sensitivities. Again, we can get that out of SCIA now. And if you don't know how to use SCIA and you don't know how to look some of those things up, someone in your shelter will be able to provide that information. Most of those are handled by your manager or supervisor when they're ordering food. Will people need bagged lunches? Oh yeah, I work night shift and I need to take a lunch to work. We can accommodate that too through various means. You can work as a mentor, or you can mentor and work as a local or event-based volunteer. If you just want to work a couple days in a shelter, you know, one is open and you're available to be a feeding SA, volunteer for that. Learn how to communicate and report meals and snacks. You may not necessarily be the one filling in the blanks on the reporting screens, but you have to understand how meals are reported and how we communicate that to the upstream for ordering. And then again, don't forget your outside clients, the people that maybe staying in their cars, but they do come in for meals and they come in to use the bathrooms and things like that. So don't forget them as you're working your congregate feeding. Slide, please. Again, observe. This is really kind of an important thing. Are people showing up at the proper feeding times? Do we need to adjust feeding times? Is there some reason? Are a lot of the people part of a shift work, factory workers, shift workers? Do we need to adjust our feeding times to accommodate shift work? What kinds of snack does the population seem to prefer? Are there enough meals available? Was I short? Was I over? How much waste are we generating? Are we meeting the dietary needs of our clients? Those are things that you can observe and you can talk to your clients. Again, you can ask them yourselves and then communicate it to the shelter manager, or if you have a feeding supervisor, feeding manager, all these things can be communicated up, and we can help our clients by getting to yes to meet their dietary needs. That doesn't mean someone says, I want a steak tonight. I don't feel like eating your spaghetti and meatballs. We're not going to go out and order a steak dinner for someone that just doesn't prefer. But we will get to yes for if there's dietary sensitivities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so participation. Maybe there's just a few people showing up for meals, but you have meals that are sitting out. It's important to tempt those meals and make sure that they're following all the safe food handling guidelines. Again, those will be talked about another thing. Specialty meals, talk to clients and your health services team. They can also tell you about people that they know might need a special diet. We can order meals from hospital kitchens for people that have maybe renal requirements or cardiac requirements. We can manage those as long as we know and let other people, let our ordering managers and supervisors know. Be proactive. If we seem to be running short of things, if we're running out of snacks, make sure we communicate that. And water, particularly. We have a lot of donations of water and snacks, but they may not be things that our clients are interested in consuming. So again, participate and make sure it's important. It's important to communicate those things. Organize and clean out refrigerated foods. That goes along with the safe food handling. Again, making sure that when you do put food in the refrigerator, you have to label it the time that you put it in. So if you're the person that's putting food away, make sure it's labeled, the time and the date that it was delivered. And that's what's very important. And then monitor the excess food storage. And what I'm saying by that is make sure that it gets discarded when it's reached the end of its life cycle. Next slide, please.
I see a hand, Mary. Your hand is up.
Yeah, let me just remind people, please, if you really want an answer to your question, use the Q&A. I see lots of questions in the chat, and we may not be able to get to them. So please make sure if you truly want an answer, and you want an answer from our panel of experts, because we have a panel of experts ready to help reply to all your questions, please make sure those are in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. So communicating, how many meals did we serve? You're the first line there. You know how many meals we serve because you know how many you put out. You know how many what types of foods are enjoyed. You can hear clients. You can tell when people say pizza, third night in a row. That was not fun. Again, like we're trying, and when I order meals, I try to order a variety of meals if there's a multi-day shelter we'll use pizza, we'll use fast food the first night. And then after that, we really, really, really try to focus on what foods our clients will consume. Do we have a need for go bags? What snacks are most popular? Do we have sufficient supplies, cleaning, service, storage? All these things are things that you as an SA can communicate to your supervisor or a shelter manager. Okay, next slide, please. Oops. So what opportunities do I have to exercise my service associate gap in feeding? Well, you can attend chapter and regional meetings where your local leadership will advise you of opportunities. We recently had a large training hosted in our Everett chapter office, and I was able to call 2 feeding SAs to help us with that. And they set up I had the food ordered and delivered, and they set up the most lovely arrangement for our food. They arranged the tables, they cleaned up everything, they made sure we had water, they put serving utensils and all the accoutrements out, and it was just so delightful to have that. So there's opportunities in your local and regional area that aren't disaster related where you can exercise your feeding gap. Talk to your DPM about mentors in your chapter. We have a lot of long-time volunteers who have gone through all the iterations of feeding, from cooking in a field kitchen, cooking in a disaster location, like on a search and rescue operation, all different kinds of things. And they have evolved with the Red Cross as the Red Cross has changed its requirements. So they're also good mentors, because a lot of times you can ask a question and they can tell you a little bit about the history of why we now do it the way we do. A lot of times they'll take you down the other path of, I wish we still did it this way, but it's good to have a mentor, someone who can keep you enthused. And they also are very familiar with the vendors in your area who like to support the Red Cross. So I like to have a mentor who's been around a long time because they have the contacts. You can also work as a local volunteer on a smaller disaster response. I know everybody likes to deploy, they want to go to the big disasters, but our smaller shelters absolutely need staff, and feeding service associates are so important in those smaller shelters, because we don't get enough shelter workers on a apartment fire or a smaller disaster. And when I'm saying smaller disaster, what I mean is a smaller shelter, where we may have less than 20 people. So it's a really good place to get experience and to be firsthand. And it also is a good opportunity to meet your local volunteers. You can also do tabling events and service to armed forces, support those activities in your area. And then you can help with Blue Sky, which Blue Sky is our steady state work. That's when we're not deployed to a disaster, but there's still work that has to be done. There's vendors to contact, there's agreements to make. There's lots of work keeping the coffee kits up to date, keeping abreast of changes in the feeding philosophy of the Red Cross. There's just lots of work in Blue Skies. Next slide, please. Okay, tips for becoming a great feeding service associate. I think I've kind of hammered that one. Build relationships with your local people or with your with anybody that you can. Find yourself a mentor, build a relationship. Learn how the various roles in the shelter are interdependent. I keep alluding to making communicating with your shelter manager, because sometimes you don't have a feeding supervisor or you don't have a dedicated feeding person. So you are working with the local shelter manager. Constantly review the feeding toolkit in OneSource. I say from time to time, because It doesn't change a lot, but there are new things coming out periodically. So just because you looked at it 6 years ago doesn't mean it's relevant today. So just review the material on one source from time to time. Be flexible, adaptable, and ready to take on a field promotion. Aha, there we go. That's why this is capacity building workshop is so important. I'm starting off with the basics, but as we go on, we'll talk about some of the management responsibilities, and they can be intimidating. But if you're thrown into a DR and you get a field promotion, someone says, we need you to be a supervisor. Be ready. So take as many courses as you can. And one of the things I like to recommend is taking the IRV specialty track training so that you can do mobile feeding if that's something that you would enjoy more. Those are usually on the larger disasters where you can drive around in the IRVs and serve food. And it's the emergency response vehicle. But I encourage you to take that even if you don't want to deploy there. You may not have, you can be an EBV or an event-based volunteer, a trained event-based volunteer through the Red Cross, and just show up for a couple days and serve the food. You don't have to be a driver, but if you've taken the IRV specialty track training, then you're ready to go. Next slide, please. So I'm going to whiz through these last slides so that there's Q&A time. I have learned through experience that I needed to build myself a go bag. And this was something that my very first mentor told me. She says, you're going to get somewhere and you're going to find things that you don't have, because the first night of setup, the trailer could be delayed. They couldn't have find a driver. There's just things that you're going to need. So I have a small go bag that I pack and take with me. And here are some of the things that I throw into that bag. Next slide, please. Hand sanitizers. That's really important. And we know why. Next slide. Assorted gloves. You may need gloves, but someone else on your team may need gloves, and I'm a big double glover. So I'll put the kind of gloves that are shown here on the screen. They're a little more form-fitting. They're like the nitrile or the latex, not latex, but the food safe gloves that when your hand gets sweaty, they stick to you. So I put those plastic gloves over the top of these gloves, and then I can just slide the plastic gloves on and off as I need to change them a lot faster. Another thing is I carry blue gloves and the clear gloves or the white gloves, because if I'm doing cleaning, I know I use the blue gloves for cleaning and the white gloves for handling food. So that's just my little routine, because it's so easy to start cleaning up and pick up a cleaning wipe or something and then go over and hand somebody some food. And you've contaminated with the chemicals from what you were cleaning. So I think that's something that I've learned that helps me keep things separate. Next slide. There's the disposable gloves. Those are the ones I put over the I'll call them the form-fitting hand gloves. Next slide. The hair covering and disposable apron. If you don't find disposable aprons in your shelter trailers, ask your logistics person. Get in contact with them and get some disposable aprons, because you're constantly rubbing up against things, against food containers, when you're loading things into the refrigerators, when you're taking things out of containers, when you're cleaning up. So there's, it's really just good to have some disposable aprons and hair covering. Next slide. Masks. Those are for your protection and for the protection of others. Next slide. I just have a handful of those in mine, and I have a small first aid kit. It's easy to get little cuts or burns and things, and it's important to put a Band-Aid over it and then cover your hand with a glove. So I always have a small first aid kit in my go bag. Next slide. Notepad. That's where I put those things, notes that I want to communicate up chain. Next slide. Thermometer. Can't tell you how many times I've been on a DR and the thermometer is missing from the shelter kit. So I carry a thermometer with me. They're not expensive. I asked my logistics person to keep some on hand, and if they're easy for people to put in their pocket and walk off with. It's not intentional, it just happens. You tempt something, stick it in your apron pocket or you stick it in your vest, and oh my gosh, I got home and here I have a thermometer. So I carry a couple in my go bag. Next slide. Other essentials I keep, I see Sharpie marker, blue tape, some poster paper, my cell phone with access to Skya, phone numbers of essential Red Cross contacts. That's where I keep my mentors and other people that I need to contact. Next slide. And a small flashlight. And I don't very often need a can opener, and I used to carry a P38. If any of you are ex-military, you know what those are. But I used to carry a P38. I now carry a full-size can opener. I don't use it very often, but there are times when I've needed to open a coffee can. And there you go. There you need a can opener sometimes. I think that's the end of my presentation. So, Iwi, did you want to monitor the questions?
Yep. Thank you so much, Jerry, and thank you so much for presenting. I do see a lot of comments in the chat.
Iwi, we can't hear you.
Can you not hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, let me turn off my. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. You can hear me.
I'll see you.
Okay, so I was saying that thank you so much, Mary and Jerry, for presenting. And I do see there are comments, questions in the meeting chat, and I see a few in the Q&A as well. We do have about 15 minutes. Let's do the logistical questions first that I can answer. Then we'll pass the feeding questions to Mary and the panel. Mary, is there anyone else that you want to bring on for answering the questions?
Actually, not at this time, but we do have
Okay.
several regional feeding leads on that can assist if we need it.
Okay, great. So logistical questions first. Meeting links. The meeting links will be the same for each week. I will send reminder emails each week as well. The slides and the recording will be also attached to the meeting itself, the meeting reminder emails. Feel free to share. Anyone can attend. You do not have to be to have a service associate gap for the feeding or sheltering. Anyone is welcome to attend. And pardon the noise in here. I am in a disaster relief operation, so it's a little noisy. Let's go to the questions. Let's go to the Q&A questions first. Panel, so we have a question that since the transition to use the feeding vendors, are we able to provide the camp rules to the vendors for them to use?
Jerry, do you want me to take that or do you want to?
Go ahead, Mary. I mean, I know from
Yes.
experience, but you can
Yes,
speak.
you can. You can. Yes, we are using Cambros. When we went away from the COVID protocols, we are able to serve food cafeteria style. So yes, you are. You know, of course, proper cleaning, which will be covered in session 3. I think it's session 3 of the Cambros is important, but yes, you can provide that. An additional trick is what we do sometimes, especially in our rural areas, is we provide the vendors with those aluminum trays because if we're close, it'll stay hot long enough. Of course, if you're driving a distance like some other rural areas in Oregon and Washington, and even Idaho and Northern California, you'll want to make sure that it can stay hot. So Cambros your best option. But yes, you can be providing Cambros to the vendors for that bulk feeding.
Thank you. And on the topic of feeding and meals, do we have a limit of dollar amount for individual meals? And if so, how much is the cost limit?
I love that question because I get it every single time I talk about feeding. So let me say it like this. There is no national limit for the cost of meals. Period. Hard stop. Okay. What we're looking for is quality versus cost. Now, we're expecting our volunteers to be cognizant of the donor dollars, to be reasonable. We are not, like Jerry said earlier, we're not going out and buying steak and lobsters, but we know in very, very rural Washington, your meals are going to be much more expensive than Bakersfield, California. Okay, so it's going to depend on your locale. And I can tell you, in LA, while LA is very expensive because there's a lot of competition, prices pretty much stay what in the middle range. Okay, so we're close to $35-40 a day per person for all three meals, but that's not the case in Northern California. So you're closer to $45 a day. So be reasonable, but focus on the quality of the meal, the balanced, healthy, quality meal for our clients. That's what makes this transformational. And again, like Jerry said, if I stand near a food line and I hear it's Tuesday, it must be pizza, I just cringe. So you have my permission to seek out great food for our clients.
Thank you. And I'm going to go from the newest questions first. Is it possible to include instructions of how to make coffee, how much coffee grounds to use?
I'll take that one, Mary.
Go for it.
Okay, that is one thing that in our region I have, yes, it is possible, but you have to take the lead to do that. And I have it taped on the inside of some of our kits now because first of all, it depends on the kind of coffee and the kind of coffee maker you're using too. So I want to have our leads check what kind of coffee makers are included and then what kind of coffee they use. And they change that periodically. They'll also include the right scoops. So it's something that's a lead person kind of has to manage. It's really, really difficult to do, but we had it inside our coffee makers at one time, and the coffee makers got washed and then they put the papers back in. So we've decided to laminate them, and we've done that on a couple DRs. But I can just say instructions get lost if they're not permanently affixed somewhere or included somewhere. But yes, it's my pet peeve to go somewhere and not be able to know how to make the coffee.
And we have coffee directions in our kits as well. Good question.
Thank you. Next question is, when is it appropriate for us to have a virtual team supporting the ground, whether it's virtual feeding service associate or feeding supervisors? When is it appropriate, and are they going to be in constant connection with the sheltering team?
Well, I think it's appropriate anytime it makes sense for you. I've done virtual feeding supervising from my home in Monterey, California for a fire up in actually an earthquake in Fortuna, California. So some 7 hours away. I was able to connect with all of the local vendors. They were small shelters, 50 or less. So I was able to connect with the vendors there. So I think it really is up to your region. I don't know. I don't believe our region has a policy on it. So, if it works, if you can't deploy in person and you can do it virtually, I say go for it. Jerry?
Well, this year I wasn't able to deploy very much because I'm full-time babysitter for my grandkids. So I have done that several times, been the virtual provider and staffed the shelter with an essay, and then ordered all the food, worked with logistics to get it delivered. So I think, again, like Mary said, when it makes sense, it works.
Perfect.
Thank you. And can we touch generally, as in if you need more courses, whether it's EDGE, whether it's ERV trainings, emergency response vehicle trainings, whom can you reach out to and where can you look for those resources?
Okay, so more courses beyond the feeding essay? Is that the question?
As in, if I'm brand new to the Red Cross that I don't have a feeding gap,
Oh,
where do I go to see what courses do I need?
in the courses are in EDGE. The list of courses is in OneSource. Iwei, can we drop that in the chat afterwards?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. This is more of a comment, but I think it's a good comment that oftentimes, or that, we have people that have been told that if you have a dietary restrictions, then you're not allowed to deploy. Do you have any tips, suggestions, any comment on that?
Okay, so Jerry, do you, I had never heard that because we always have dietary meals for our clients. So let me go to our panel of experts. Jerry, do you know that they're
I
being
don't
told?
know. I don't know of a directive on that, but I do know that I have accommodated nutritional needs or dietary restrictions for volunteers just as easily as I do for shelter clients.
And we did in LA as well. Julia Bishop, can you come off mic and give us your take on this, please?
1 second, let me unmute her.
Oh, I guess I should have done that originally.
Okay, Julia, you're able to unmute now.
Okay. Okay, so you're talking about the dietary problems or concerns that we have?
We're talking about deployment restrictions. Someone's being told that they can't deploy because they have dietary restrictions. And I had never heard that. Obviously, that's coming from their workforce engagement people, I would assume.
That's
have
not
you?
factual. I just had,
Okay.
I did have somebody just come here. They workforce came to me and said, we have someone that's gluten-free coming to the DR. Can I support them? I said, I'll do what I can, but I also need them to be aware and to support themselves with things that they may need, because I can't always control what the food is that we're going to be ordering.
Perfect. Excellent. And Vicki has her hand up. Oops, a couple of hands up.
Yeah, so the only thing I can think of where this might be the case is that every once in a long while, on a specific DR, they will announce that for at least a certain period of time, 2 to 4 weeks at the beginning, that they cannot accommodate any accommodation needs. So in your volunteer connection profile, if you have any accommodation needs, or just in general that you have any needs, they say anybody with a specific accommodation need cannot deploy at that time. It's very rare, but they have done that.
So okay, and that's understandable. And I would say that, in most cases, the feeding team would definitely try to accommodate that, just like they do our clients. But that also, when you deploy, you're given a mission card, and those are for your specific meals. Even if they're feeding, like for example, for the first 2 weeks of some large DRs, they feed everybody, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then the volunteers, eventually, as the DR goes on, you're responsible for your own meals. There are some nuances to that, of course. But my suggestion would be just to make sure your deployment team knows that you're willing to handle your own meals if it cannot be accommodated. Julia, we have one more minute.
My ERV coordinator on the job here currently in Kentucky brought a lot of her own food or knows what to buy on the DR because she does have dietary restrictions. And that's all you have to do is to be aware of those things so that it isn't a hardship for the feeding team to try and support your feeding needs.
Perfect. We have time, I think, for one more question, maybe? Maybe two?
Yes.
Okay.
The one more question will be related to dietary restrictions as well.
Okay.
If the whole entire shelter only has one single person that has dietary restrictions, are we able to accommodate this one single person?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have time for one more question.
I'm not seeing too many questions. There are more comments asking for herb trainings, asking
Okay.
for, go ahead.
Well, there were, I think Lisa Lane had several questions. They ended up in the chat, not in the Q&A, but they were around the kitchen issue. And I want to make sure that that she understands, we use kitchens for a lot of things, even though we are not necessarily cooking. Oftentimes, we'll bring in a partner who will cook in a kitchen with a facility that has a kitchen, even if the Red Cross staff is not the one doing it. So kitchens are a luxury. We don't always have it, but when we do, like Jerry said, we want to make sure we're able to use the equipment, use the facility fully. Of course, we replace cleaning supplies or whatever we use if they allow us to, or we bring in our own. So yeah, I mean, pots and pans and those kinds of things, believe it or not, we use it for a lot of things. And if we have an opportunity with refrigerators, we can chill beverages that we put out. Oh, and there was a quick question about snacks. Someone was told not that they needed to reduce the amount of snacks. I've never heard that. I can tell you Brad Kaiserman's a big supporter of snacks. And actually, we don't count snacks anymore because there's a calculation that is put into our reporting system for automatically counting snacks. I think they figure 6 per day. Never had an issue with it. If people prefer to snack rather than have a meal, go for it. We're 1 minute over.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you, the panel, for answering the questions. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same link, and everything will be recorded. The link will be sent out later on as well. The meeting will be posted on YouTube tonight. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Iwe, for all your support.